folks to join. A reminder that the meeting is, this meeting is being recorded.
Bienvenidos a todos. En un minuto comenzamos y nada más para recordarles que esta junta está siendo grabada.
All right, Susan, do you want to kick things off?
Sure. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the joint meeting of the General Plan Advisory Committee and the Community Workshop or Community Educational Session for this evening. I'm going to turn it over before we get officially started to Maria.
Buenas tardes, bienvenidos al Comité Asesor del Plan General o a lo que llamamos al Taller para la Comunidad. Y antes de comenzar, le voy a dar la palabra a María.
Great, thank you. So good evening, everybody. We do have translation services this evening, so this will be live translated throughout the evening. I will turn it over to Lori to get us officially started for the evening.
Buenas tardes,
Actually,
vamos a...
Yeah, hold on. Aram, do you want to start the live interpretation? Okay.
Vamos a tener interpretación al español a lo largo de esta tarde.
Do we need to have a slide up, Matt, that shows how to do that?
Yeah, actually, Veronica, can you share your screen? And everyone, at the bottom of your screen, there is an interpretation button, and everyone should pick English or Spanish. Okay, next slide, Veronica.
Give everyone a chance to take a look at that. And then now I will turn it over to Lori to officially launch us into the meeting.
Thank you. I was over here trying to find the button myself. Welcome, everyone. This is our fourth GPAC meeting. I'm very happy that we're gathered here, even though the meeting's a week after than we normally do. Thank you for being here. This is a joint educational forum on housing. This is what we were so excited to talk about and learn more about. Tonight's meeting will begin with one in a two-part series on housing. The first is educational, as I just said. The second will be coming in the next 2 weeks, and that'll be focused more on policy. We're really pleased to see everyone here. And we already know that you believe and know that housing is a critical issue that affects all of us, whether it's communities of concern like seniors on a fixed income or students returning home from college, job seekers who are trying to get their starter home. I mean, whatever those issues are, they're all important. Without affordable housing units, our children can't return to Ventura after graduating college. Young families won't be able to move here, all those things. There are also economic dimensions to this too, because major employers won't want to stay in Ventura if there's not enough housing to support their workforces. I, for one, when I sat on VCOG, the Ventura Council of Governments, as one council member of 10, we had the Naval Warfare Center commander, chief commander, come to us and beg us as council members from the 10 cities in the county to start thinking about getting housing, because they would lure or get people that they wanted to hire, but the people would not accept the jobs because they could not find a place to live. That is a very sad statement. We're not talking about people who are would not be good contributors to our economy, our community. We're talking about people that we're turning away who would be good contributors to our economy and our community. All these considerations mean that housing is a key to maintaining Ventura's social, cultural, and economic vibrancy. I always say we need to diversify the city of Ventura's economic portfolio, and in this case, our housing portfolio. It's so important that we're here to strategize about how we can make Ventura the best it can be for everyone now and 20 years or 30 years in the future. And tonight, we have the city housing consultant, Veronica Tam, from Veronica Tam and Associates, who will be giving a presentation that summarizes existing housing conditions in the city and various state laws and regulations that currently apply to housing. She'll also discuss the requirements and process for the housing element. As you may recall, the housing element is the only part of the general plan that requires state approval, and that we are forced to be sure that we turn in by, I believe it's before the end of this year in October. And the presentation will be followed by a Q&A in which the GPAC and the public will be welcome to discuss key issues and ask questions. On the 29th, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be doing a deeper dive into programs and policy options for the city as we move forward. And with that, I've said enough. Thank you for being here. I'll turn it over to Matt and Veronica to get things started. I wasn't sure if Councilmember Halter was going to say something in the beginning or the end, but Matt and Veronica.
Lori, I think you've done a great job with the introduction, and I'll hold any comments I have for the end, if that's okay with you.
Oh, that's perfectly fine.
Okay.
Just a quick recognition of the GPAC members. Their names are up on the screen. We won't do a formal roll call, but Netta is taking a visual roll call and making sure that we are a visual accounting of everyone that's here this evening. So just a thank you again to all the GPAC members for your dedication and hard work on this project. And with that, I think I'll turn it over to Matt to go over the agenda, and then we'll get started on the presentation.
Yep. Good evening, everyone. Again, it's great to see you all here tonight and to have so many members of the community who are interested in hearing about housing. Tonight, as was mentioned by our chair, Lori, it's a combination of a GPAC meeting and an educational forum. Many of you who have been involved in the process have probably been to both a GPAC meeting or an educational forum. But what we're going to do tonight is a presentation and an overview of existing housing conditions in the city, an overview of the housing element requirements, a summary of some of the engagement that has occurred to date, where housing, not surprisingly, is quite an important topic for the community, and then an overview of the housing element update process, which we know has caused a little bit of confusion because of state requirements. Following the presentation, we're going to do a Q&A and discussion. A couple of notes just to keep in mind about this. We're going to start with the GPAC members first for questions and comments. If GPAC members could please put GPAC in front of their name, that would be helpful for us so we can easily identify you and so the public can identify who you are. And then following GPAC, we'll do a public Q&A and discussion as well, and then end with public comment if anyone has public comments after that. I'm going to ask everyone to keep comments brief so that everyone can have a chance to talk, and keep questions brief as well. If you do go on too long, Susan or I may interrupt. Next slide, please. I'm going to give this is our project update, project overview, just to remind everyone where we are and what's going on. For those who haven't been paying attention, we are actually doing a general plan update. And we are well into our process here. The general plan is the guiding policy document, and it looks 25 to 30 years ahead. There are 8 required elements as part of the general plan. One of those is housing. Housing is one of the most technical elements. It is an element that needs to be updated every 8 years and must be reviewed by the state Department of Housing and Community Development, and therefore it is actually it is the only one of the elements that needs to be reviewed in its entirety by the state. Next slide, please. We are currently in our phase of work here. These are the 6 phases of the general plan update. We're currently sort of in between, in this bridge between the discovery phase and the visioning phase. Our next GPAC meeting, we're actually going to work on visioning, and then that will lead to community engagement around visioning. So we're right at the sort of the cusp of between discovery and visioning, but we are really taking a deep dive into housing now just because of the timing of the requirements for the state and because it is such an important topic for the community. So there's a lot more to come, engagements happening throughout the process, but we are well into it, but still towards the beginning of the process. Next slide. With that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Veronica. Veronica Tam, just by way of introduction, is a subconsultant to Ramey & Associates on this project. I've been working with Veronica for over 20 years, and I think she is the best in the state dealing and preparing housing elements. She's prepared hundreds of them in her career. She knows this information inside and out. If there is anything that is, she's going to present some technical information. So if you have questions about that technical information, please jot them down and we're happy to answer those questions. Okay, Veronica, take it away.
Great, thank you, Matt. So just like Matt's talking about, housing is probably one of the most kind of critical element of the general plan because we are facing a statewide housing crisis. And what the State Department of Housing and Community Development has identified that there is a shortage of housing production in the last 2 or 3 decades throughout the state. And as a result of that, we have a lack of housing supply, which leads to price escalation and displacement and gentrification. And we have a lot of families and households or individuals having difficulty identifying or looking for adequate housing. So the State Housing and Community Development Department, HCD, you'll hear that I use this agency. I talk about this agency quite frequently throughout the presentation. HCD projected in the next 8-10 years or so, the state needs to add 3.5 million new units throughout the entire state. And that, because of the lack of production in the last 2 or 3 decades, the new state laws that we've been seeing through down from Sacramento are focusing on making sure local jurisdictions address this existing shortfall in terms of production, in addition to the housing needs that you're projected to need because of growth. So we are not only having to deal with production in the future, but we also need to kind of compensate for not producing in the past. And that's what the housing laws that we are dealing with today, that's the kind of framework we're dealing with. Also, the new state laws are recognizing that there are a lot of governmental constraints as it relates to housing production. So all the new state laws are related to local development standards and procedures and making sure that production can occur in a more timely manner. The other parts of the state law focuses on creating funding for housing, not only for planning, housing planning, but also housing production. But what we also know is the amount of funding that, no matter how hard they try, the amount of funding available at this time through the state is not anywhere near what we would need to address the housing needs in the state. So now let me just kind of go through some of the new laws and the policy direction from Sacramento. So that would kind of relates to how the housing element, has to be drafted in a certain ways. One is removing the constraints to production, to development, by reducing fees, by making development standards more objective, by streamlining the process for approving and reviewing housing element. There's a lot of bills that deals with by right approval of housing through the Housing Accountability Act and even through the housing element law. I don't know why it moved, sorry, it shouldn't have. The other slide deals with increasing capacity. The other laws deals with increasing capacity, increasing areas that are zoned for housing, and also making sure that the areas that we're identifying for residential development has like real potential for development. Expanding housing options, not just building single-family neighborhoods, but also providing housing options for special needs population, for the homeless, and using alternative housing types to fulfill the affordable housing needs in our community. So that's just some of the key policy directions, but there've been a lot of new bills coming down from Sacramento. That's the major areas of focus. So now we just want to move on to kind of give you some background about Ventura today, just looking at some of the demographic trends that kind of impact housing or impact the needs for housing. Just looking at your population trend, what's actually very interesting and surprised me is the fact that your population somewhat declined between 2015 and 2020, and that's based on the State Department of Finance estimate. Your housing production we'll see later on, but generally your population is in a decline. What does that typically mean? It usually means that families are not moving into the city because or that they're leaving the city because they cannot find affordable housing. What you will be left with are more the aging population that remains in the community, and that typically is a reflection of your housing stock that is not keeping up with the demands of a growing community. So that's something that we need to look at in the future when we look at the housing element. Now, coming back and looking at your housing production and your population, just like we mentioned before, your population actually decreased somewhat, and this is the 2021 numbers a little bit. The earlier one was 2020, so we can compare with GPAC, but with 2021, you still see really a reduction between 2010 and 2021 in terms of population, but your housing certainly has increased. So again, what it means is that maybe you're producing housing that are not necessarily attracting families or young families to come to your community, and that's why your population is declining. But your housing production, it's increasing, but not in extensively, like it's not in a very fast rate, but still increasing. This is your age distribution according to the American Community Survey. Generally, just looking at this, you would see that you have a bulge in the middle age and people who are entering senior population. So the young adults are the ones that you are kind of like has the smallest proportion in the community. So if you see this and then you think about how this is going to move forward in the next 8-10 years, then you're going to have a lot of people that are entering into the senior population in the community. So you have an aging population, and how do you address that in your housing element? And looking at some of the demographics about the state of housing in Ventura today, tenure-wise, owner versus renter, the city of Ventura is generally more owner-occupied than the county, or than GPAC actually as a whole. So generally, you have more owner-occupied housing that's for sale rather than rental housing compared to the entire GPAC region. And looking at housing, kind of like householders, the age of householders by owner versus renter is very obvious of like a reverse kind of picture. The homeowners tend to be older, renters tend to be younger in the city of Ventura. And this is very typical. It's not, just for the city of Ventura, but that's very typical because younger households, younger families, and young adults, they cannot afford homeownership. And therefore they tend to be renters. And homeowners are usually people who are more stable financially, and therefore they tend to be homeowners. So if you're building housing that are not affordable to the young families, and certainly if you're not building more opportunities for the younger households, you're not going to see an increase of young population in the community. And just looking at the distribution of housing types, again, Ventura is a little bit more in the single family neighborhoods. Combined single family attached and detached, you have about 65, 66%, 2/3 of your housing type is in the single family neighborhoods, a little bit more than the whole region. And that's part of the reason why some of the aging population, or maybe decreasing population in the younger population, in the younger age groups. And looking at your current distribution of housing, your general plan, right now, the majority of your residential areas are certainly planned for lower density residential uses, single family homes, and much smaller proportion of your land use, residential land use, is dedicated for multifamily housing. Your age, your housing stock is generally old, because a lot of your, more than 2/3 or more, close to 80% of your housing is more than 40 years old. And so that's generally a community that may have some rehabilitation needs when it comes to improving and the quality of your housing in your community. And now look at income distribution. Your overall income distribution, according to SCAG, using the American Community Survey, is that you have a smaller proportion of people who are making above moderate income, more in the lower income category. So you have proportionally more people who are making less than 80% of the area median income, about 45% compared to 40% of the county as a whole. And this is looking at it from a tenure distribution. This data comes from HUD, and because it comes from HUD, the top limit of the income categories they look at are people who make up to 80% of the area median income, because all of the HUD programs benefit only people up to 80%. So anybody who are above 80% of the area median income fall into one group. But again, you can see that renters who tend to be younger, in the earlier slide when we look at the age of the householders, renters tend to be younger, and that they are also more likely to be lower income. This slide kind of look at your housing costs. We looked at the median housing home prices change in 2016 to 2021. The city of Ventura, you can tell that your change is actually probably more significant than others, even though Oxnard has a very rapid change as well, but their general base of their median home price are lower by the city, but you have your price escalation between 2016 and 2021 is higher than some higher cost community like Camarillo and also like the county, generally at the similar to the county, but higher than some of the higher cost community like Camarillo. In terms of rents, that increase is also pretty significant as well between 2016 and 2021. You can see that the rents have increased probably around 30-something% in most cases. When a household spend more than 30% of their income on housing, they're considered to be cost burdened. These are the households who have less ability to adjust to any sudden change in their financial situation, such as the loss of income or loss of employment, as we will see, as we are seeing actually during the COVID impact, that households, when they lost income or that they are going, their ability to do full-time job is compromised because of COVID. A lot of households that have cost burden are the ones that are most at risk of becoming homeless. And again, there is the disparities between renters and owners. Renters tend to have more households that are cost burdened. So the lower the income, the higher the cost of the rental housing, the less likely that they're going to be able to afford the housing and therefore paying more than 30% of their income on housing, and they're more at risk of becoming homeless in the event of sudden change in the financial situation. Especially for those who are making very low income, more than 80% of them pay more than 30% of their income on housing. These are probably the considered most at risk. When we talk about housing, we also talked about the special needs of certain groups. There are people who can generally get housing in the market. But there are people, because of their special circumstances or the unique needs that they have, would have more difficulty finding housing. Based on state law, there are 6 groups of special needs populations: farm workers, homeless, seniors, female-headed households, because female-headed households, statistically speaking, they tend to be lower income, higher percentage of them in poverty, particularly those who are responsible for taking care of the kids. So that's why female-headed households are considered a special needs group in state law. Large households with 5 or more members, again, because they have more difficulty finding adequately sized and affordable housing, and they also tend to be lower income given the household size. Persons with disabilities is another group that has special housing needs. On top of that, certainly as a local jurisdiction, you can add additional considerations, additional special needs groups. If you're located in near a military base, you may want to add veterans or active duty military personnel because they tend to have lower income. College students, they also, college students are not recognized as low income per se, but what they do have an impact on is your local rental housing market, because they are transient in nature. They may come and go depending on the summer or the quarters. So they have an impact on your rental housing market. Emancipated youth, those are youth that are foster, like aging out of the foster care system, but they're not at a point where they can be financially independent and be able to find housing on their own. So that's certainly a question that I would have for the community, for the city, is what other special needs groups should we include in the housing element? And now I'm going to go and talk a little bit about affordable housing. What does that mean? We have talked about that a little bit earlier, that if you spend more than 30% of your household income on housing, that's considered not affordable. That's a general state law standard. But there are housing that are affordable at the market, which doesn't happen very often anymore in California, but there may be still the generally older housing stock that could be still affordable at market. And that's also the reason why it's very important to preserve your existing housing stock and improve the quality of it, so that you continue to maintain a naturally affordable stock of housing. But we certainly are seeing a lot of these older housing stock. They are being at risk of economically induced displacement. They may not be induced because by development itself, but they're certainly induced by the overall economic pressure on the market and causing displacement in the community. So how do we protect some of these tenants for economic displacement? But then when we generally talk about housing, affordable housing in the housing element context, we're talking about housing that is subsidized with public funds or developed with incentives, and they're deed restricted as affordable housing for lower income or moderate income use. The challenges about creating this affordable housing is the fact that the amount of subsidies required is quite extensive. Very often, the limited funding available requires a nonprofit to use multiple funding sources, to kind of assemble multiple funding sources in order to get an affordable housing project done. And being able to layer these multi-source funding, it's challenging because you don't always be able to get the timing of the funding to work for your project. And that's why sometimes an affordable housing project may take a few years to assemble the funding required. Site control is another competition. When there is limited land out there available for development, and you're competing with the market rate developer, that's very difficult because a lot of the market rate developers are able to, however they get loans or cash, they're able to get the properties very quickly. Whereas a nonprofit, they are always kind of in the struggle. A lot of the state and federal funds available for affordable housing requires that the nonprofit to have site control. But getting funding for the site control is the challenge that a lot of nonprofits have. So it's like it's a chicken and egg thing, that you're not able to get the site because you don't have money, but you're not able to get the money because you don't have the site. And so that's always a challenge. And that's why being able to do other tools and techniques to provide site for affordable housing development, that's an important consideration. Maybe using publicly owned properties, surplus properties, like community land trusts. Some of these tools may be important to consider when it comes to developing affordable housing. And as we mentioned before, having funding, it's important. But the challenge, again, a lot of the funding focuses on lower income households. What you are missing, what the state is missing, is the middle and moderate income households that still, they're moderate income or even middle income, but they're still not able to afford housing on the market. But there is no funding at the state level or federal level that can subsidize the development of housing for moderate and middle income households. And that's a concept that you've probably been hearing a lot lately, the missing middle. That's the gap of affordable housing that a lot of communities are having difficulty in meeting. This is just a slide to talk about the city of Ventura's overall housing production. We'll talk a little bit more about the regional housing needs allocation later, but the whole concept of regional housing needs allocation is part of the housing element. This the 5th cycle housing element. The city of Ventura has been assessed an allocation of 3,600 units, and the city's being able to produce about 25% of the lower income, the very low income, about 20% for low income, moderate income, just about 12%, and above moderate income, you exceeded that because at market, most units are affordable only to above moderate income. So overall, you actually have done quite well compared to a lot of jurisdictions in the state, but you can see that this middle income, again, moderate income, this missing middle, is where the challenges are, because a lot of the state, federal, and local programs focus on lower income. The market provides for the above moderate income. The middle moderate income, the missing middle, is the challenge for a lot of communities to handle. So the city's, like we said, the city's been doing quite well in terms of providing for affordable housing, in terms of construction. You do also have some key initiatives when it comes to preserving affordable housing. You have an owner-occupied housing rehab program. Unfortunately, the scope of it has to be reduced in the past because of the limited funding. You do have mobile home parks, rent stabilization as one way to kind of tenant protection kind of strategy. And specifically, you do also have a mobile home rehab grant program to help fix up the mobile homes. Rental acquisition and rehab program, that is still something that the city does have a program for, and recently the Housing Authority purchased and deteriorated 32-unit apartment and improved that as affordable housing. Home buyer assistance, you actually don't have funding for it anymore, except that you are working with your inclusionary program. You do have an inclusionary program that has the for sale component. And so you do work with the Ventura County Community Development Collaborative in trying to kind of market the inclusionary for sale housing. Housing choice vouchers, about 1,200 households in Ventura utilizes that. So overall, in terms of preserving housing, these are the programs, but I think when we, earlier slide, we looked at that almost 80% of your housing stock is over 40 years old. So what would be the future kind of actions or initiatives to continue to improve your preserve your existing housing stock, or even expand your rehab programs in the future? You also have initiatives to enhance affordability. When we talked about earlier that slides that you have about 25% of your you met about 25% of your very low income RHNA, about 20% of your low income RHNA. That's primarily because a lot of your current rental housing multifamily construction, the developers are utilizing density bonus. And that's how you get affordable housing in your multifamily and the lower income categories. And that's a key kind of strategy, a density bonus for the city, for multifamily construction. You do have an inclusionary ordinance, but it currently applies to for sale housing only, like we mentioned about. It's not, so your affordable lower moderate income, lower income units doesn't come from your inclusionary policy. Accessory dwelling units, you do have, you're beginning to see more of that. At this point, it's not a very significant trend yet, but you probably will see more of that in the future. The city also has a very robust 10-year plan to end homelessness. You acquired and rehabbed a 55-bed year-round shelter, and that's certainly something that's very significant as a local jurisdiction being able to do. Are there anything more that the city would want to do in the future? How are you going to deal with the homeless in the future? Farm worker housing, you've done recently the construction of the Snapdragon Place. That's a farm worker housing apartment. Infill first strategy, that's still the city's kind of ideas about providing for affordable housing, not focusing on infill properties first. And certainly in your current housing element, city-owned properties for affordable housing, like we mentioned before, having site control is a challenge for nonprofits. So being able to utilize city-owned properties for affordable housing is important. Now we go back a little bit more about housing element law. What does the housing element, really mean and required to do? Matt mentioned that before. The housing element is part of your general plan. It's one of the 8 mandated elements of the general plan. What we need to do in the housing element is to assess the housing needs in the community and what's the best way to accommodate those needs, and not only for your current residents, but for future residents to come in the city of Ventura. But the housing element is also very, very different from the rest of the general plan. It's the only, well, I shouldn't say the only element, but the housing element is subject to very detailed statutory requirements rather than general plan guidelines. It's subject to very stringent, very detailed statutory requirements that are codified in the government code. It has to be updated periodically every 8 years or so. Now, if the beginning slides, when Matt mentioned about the general plan is usually updated every 10, 15 years, but the planning horizon is about 20, 25 years. The housing element, the planning horizon is 8 years, and you have to update it every 8 years subject to a statutory deadline. That's no other elements of the general plan have these requirements. Being in the Southern California Association of Governments region, SCAG region, our statutory deadline is October 15, 2021 with a 120-day grace period. So essentially, we must adopt the housing element within 120 days of the statutory deadline. That puts that drop dead date to February 12, 2022. And we'll go and explain that a little bit more later, and how the reason why we're accelerating the housing element is because of this statutory deadline. Also very different from the rest of the housing general plan is that the state HCD has to review the housing element for compliance with state law. When you have a very detailed government code requirements on the housing element, and there's an agency in charge of reviewing for compliance, there are certainly consequences for not complying with state law. Just kind of going into this a little bit about the housing element and the general plan, and what we're doing and why we're doing the housing element this way. We're currently in the 5th cycle housing element. Your 5th cycle housing element will expire October 15, 2021. And by February 12, 2022, we must have an adopted housing element that covers the planning period of 2021 to 2029. Your general plan doesn't have that kind of timeline. And your general plan covers 22, 23 years. And within that 20-something years, you'll probably fit about 3 cycles of the housing element within that. And so when you plan for your general plan, when you plan for capacity for growth, you should not plan for just this 8 years, because then you may not have remaining capacity for your 7th cycle or your 8th cycle housing element. So what you need to think about when you do your general plan is how much of a capacity should you increase would be adequate for 3 cycles of housing element. Like I mentioned before, there are consequences for non-compliance, and the housing element is probably the most frequently litigated element of the general plan. It has to be, prior to, I think, 2017, there wasn't a lot of teeth with the housing element. If you don't comply with state law, you don't comply with state law, and you get sued. But if you're not a high-profile community, you may not get sued. But in 2017, they changed all that. There's been new state law that gives HCD the ability to monitor non-compliant jurisdictions and refer them to the state attorney general for litigation. That happened in 2018 to the city of Huntington Beach. It was sued by the attorney general for continued inaction. The outcome of that was the city had to settle for it, and they ended up having to plan for more housing than they originally would have to be responsible for. You know, the housing element or housing related topics could be also sued by nonprofits and developers. And
hey, Veronica.
Yes.
Veronica, sorry to interrupt. Can you lean a little bit closer in? It's a little bit hard to hear you. It got a little hard to hear you for a second.
Okay. So when it comes to when you're being sued, some of the consequence is certainly that you can lose your ability to issue building permits. If you're being sued, the court can withhold your ability to issue building permits. You may be fined. So there are a more direct consequence when you are involved in a litigation. You will also not be eligible for state grants. Certainly the SB2 grants that a lot of jurisdictions are receiving for planning, housing planning, and you will also be receiving permanent local housing allocation as part of the SB2 grants. That as permanent local housing allocation functions almost like a block grant. As long as you're entitled to receive it, as long as you apply for it, you will get it, but you have to have a housing element that complies with state law. A lot of the state HCD administered housing funds also requires a certified housing element to be eligible. Here are the key components of the housing element, and ultimately it's your plan of actions that's the most important piece of the housing element. But to feed into that, we need to take community input. We need to look at the housing needs in your community, looking at your demographic and housing trends. We also need to look at constraints, governmental constraints, market constraints, and environmental constraints. One thing though, you are legally obligated to mitigate governmental constraints that are constraining housing production. You can't really mitigate too much of the market and environmental constraints. So, and you cannot use the lack of water or sewer service as a reason for not planning for housing. Resources, we need to look at what are the resources that you have for building new housing, like what are the site capacity, what is the development potential, how do we where do we accommodate new housing, what are the funding opportunities that you may have, and what are the partnerships that you may have in terms of making housing happen. So all these components happen together, and that would culminate to the housing plan. So when it comes to the regional housing needs allocation, the most important piece of the housing element is when it comes to the state review is the regional housing needs allocation. Every jurisdiction has that, and then every jurisdiction must accommodate your regional housing needs in order to get a certified housing element. Virtually no jurisdiction in the state will get a compliant housing element without meeting this particular piece of state law. There are some pieces of state law that may be a little bit like negotiable. Regional housing needs allocation is not negotiable. So when we look at the regional housing needs allocation, it's just basically the state has been growing significantly, even though we've seen the latest numbers that there's been a loss of population, but that's the 1 year in the last however many decades. So every jurisdiction in the state would get a regional housing needs allocation, and the state projected about 1.34 million units needs to be accommodated in the SCAG region, which is comprised of 6 counties and 191 jurisdictions. Every single jurisdiction gets a number. And this is something that you must accommodate as part of your housing element in order to get a certified housing element. And this process, like we mentioned before, start from the state. It estimated 3.5 million new units are needed in the entire state. The SCAG being the largest region in the state, we got the lion's share of that 1.34 million units. In Ventura County, being one of the smallest county in the state, you have about 24,000 units to be allocated throughout the entire county. The regional housing needs allocation is really focusing on how they allocate it within the local jurisdictions and even within the counties. Focuses heavily on access to transportation and access to jobs. And so comparing yourself with some of your neighbors, that's the reason why cities like Thousand Oaks, Camarillo, and maybe a little bit Simi Valley, their access to transportation, high quality transportation is not, it's less than yours, and therefore their allocation is smaller compared to you and Oxnard. The regional housing needs allocation is divided into income categories. Just like we talked about before, very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. Very low income are those who make up to 50% area median income, low income up to 80%, moderate income up to 120%. Your regional housing needs allocation is divided into these 4 income categories. It doesn't actually mean that you are expected to build all the units according to this income distribution. Certainly, it would be a good faith effort that you try. But what this means is you must have land use policies and development regulations that can facilitate the development of housing in these type of income categories, that is feasible, that your land use policy provide opportunities that it would be feasible to provide, to build that many lower income units, assuming that there will be funding from the state and that affordable housing would be somewhat either funded or incentivized. It doesn't mean that at market it's expected that you're gonna build these housing at these kind of income categories. So what the state actually uses is density as a default for feasibility. For Ventura County, when your population is less than 100,000, your default density is 20 units to the acre, but population over 100,000, your default density is 30 units to the acre. It means that in order to accommodate your regional housing needs allocation, particularly for your lower income arena, you must have zoning that's at least 30 units to the acre that would be considered to be feasible to develop affordable housing with reasonable amount of subsidies. That, you know, if you have only a density of like 16 units to the acre, the amount of subsidies would be so prohibitive that it would not allow a nonprofit to actually compete for funding. So what we need to do in the housing element to meet the regional housing needs allocation requirements is to facilitate housing that's on vacant or underutilized sites that have near-term development potential. Make sure that you have land use and development standards that can allow somebody to meet 30 units to the acre, and therefore, and also your development process and fees do not constrain housing development. So the obligation is that you must plan for it. You must identify adequate sites with appropriate zoning and development standards to fully accommodate the RHNA. But production itself is whatever you can do with affordable housing strategies. It may not ultimately be 2,052 units at all, because you don't have the financial capacity for it. But at least from an adequate sites capacity perspective, you have identified enough sites that it could happen. Should the market, should the funding be available, should the market calls for it. So 30 units to the acre, the default density. The state also recommend a buffer, because as we know, you can plan for the high density development, but at market, they're not gonna come in as affordable. So you should, your sites inventory should have buffers so that you continue to have the ability to accommodate potential affordable housing as sites are being developed at market. Also, it's important when we look at sites is that sites that are too small, less than half an acre, or sites that are too large are typically not acceptable as affordable housing sites, because that would be too difficult and too challenging for an affordable housing developers to use. Too small, you can't build a project that is of adequate size so that they would be competitive in funding applications. Sites that are too large, it would be very difficult for a nonprofit to actually acquire a large piece of property and build that many affordable housing units on it. Again, it would be difficult for them to be competitive for funding because there's not that much funding available. So state law says, and ideally the site size should be between 0.5 of an acre and 10 acres. So when we look at your site inventory, identifying sites, we need to look for opportunities for lot consolidation, and also strategies or incentives that the city can facilitate or and encourage lot consolidation. So the challenges when we come, when doing this housing element, certainly this RHNA for you is significant. And with very strict state law on what are the feasible sites. You have higher standards of feasibility when we're reusing sites from the previous housing element that are continue to be available. You need to offer housing choices. On the one hand, you have an aging population. How do you create a housing stock that would be appropriate for an aging population that allows your seniors to age in place, and yet also provide housing opportunities for young families and try to retain your young adults, your young families, and attracting them to the community? What type of housing young people are looking for? Are you creating neighborhoods or housing types that are desirable by the younger folks? We certainly have issues with environmental constraints in the city of Ventura. We also have the issue of lack of housing funds. So these are some of the challenges that we have to face when we're doing the housing element update. So the process of housing element update, we talked about earlier, your housing element is due no later than February 12, 2022, but the statutory deadline is really October 15. And it doesn't, that timeline, unfortunately, does not allow you adequate time to address your whole general plan update, because there's so many issues to be dealt with in your general plan update. So what we plan to do is actually identify vacant and underutilized sites based on your current general plan, your 2005 general plan. We think that there are a good potential that will identify the majority of the RENA based on areas that are not expected to change, even as part of the general plan update. What we want to do is being able to adopt the housing element on time to lock in this 8-year time frame. If we miss the October 15 and the grace period timeline, immediately and automatically your housing element is going to be converted from an 8-year housing element to a 4-year housing element. You'll be subject to getting the housing element done as soon as possible, and then you have to update the housing element in 2025, October 15, no grace period, and then you'll update it another 4 years later by October 2029, no grace period. So that the penalty for missing the housing element timeline is quite significant when it comes to having to do this housing element. It's a very expensive and very challenging process, but to have to do it every 4 years and no grace period, that is going to be very difficult. So we want to do the housing element and identify as much sites as we can within the current general plan that are not expected to change. Then when the general plan is being updated with the new land use plan, we will do a consistency analysis between the housing element and the new general plan and make sure that you continue to have the ability to meet the RENA, and your new general plan probably offer just additional opportunities for housing development, and then re-adopt the housing element at that time. So here are some of the milestones that we're working with. In June, we're working on the sites inventory right now. We plan to have an admin draft by about July, and then go through public review with the Planning Commission, the GPAC, and the City Council in August, and submit the housing element to HCD for review. We're required to do that review on the draft housing element, and the review is a 60-day review, and then move on to adoption by about November, December, and then HCD will take 3 months to review the adopted housing element, and so certification will occur about probably January 2022. So we plan to get this process done by the end of the year, but we will not have the ability to wait till the general plan process, because by then you would have missed the deadline. So here is, I guess, the process again more graphically, so that you can see the kind of the parallel efforts with the housing element, that the your land use alternatives is not going to be available until fall 2021, and by then we probably are in the HCD review process already, and so therefore we need to kind of like have the housing element on a parallel but accelerated track, and then come back later on once the land use element, the preferred land use alternative is determined. Then we will reassess the site inventory in the housing element, and then update the housing element and adopt it again. But this process would allow you to lock in with an 8-year cycle. We can fix the housing element with the new general plan anytime we want to, that we are capable to accomplish. But you're no longer, you would not have the penalty of a 4-year housing element with this timeline and process. With that, actually, I'm sorry, there are a couple more slides on community engagement that we have, what have we heard so far? We did some stakeholder interviews with affordable housing developers, and agencies and organizations serving special needs. And so What we have heard, certainly the COVID impact, it has impacted a lot of community and low-income households, but the full impact of COVID is unknown right at this time. We probably won't see that the full impact until probably at least like a few more months, a year later, when all of the kind of rent control provisions expired. Homeless population, what is also very interesting in the city is that we heard it from multiple stakeholders that your homeless population is getting older. We see more seniors that are homeless in Ventura today. The high cost of housing displacing a lot of existing residents, particularly on the rentals. There are also impacts of short-term rentals on the housing market because they're taking units available for permanent housing and become seasonally occupied and transient nature. The other top issues that may mention is that the culture and hospitality sectors are the fastest growing sectors in Ventura, but they're also the lowest paying jobs. So that kind of gives it, the reason why you're seeing a lot of your, you have a higher percentage of lower income households than the county as a whole. Underserved populations, we did ask them, and they think that certainly homeless, farm workers, emancipated youth that we also talked about, low-wage workers, those are underserved groups. What we also have heard is that you have an aging population. We also have seniors that have mental health issues. That is a growing population in the community as well. When it comes to constraints to housing development, the comments relates to not having enough land zoned for multifamily. The whole process to review and approve housing needs to be expedited or streamlined, especially for affordable housing. You have design review, but there's not really there's not really objective architectural design guidelines to make sure that the review gives developers certainty. Community engagement is an issue, and having more community engagement and also more education about the benefits of affordable housing to the community is important. Not just affordable housing, but increased housing in the community. What's the benefit? And having the ability to do that engagement on a continuous basis would be important. Your height limit and your parking requirements were also identified as key kind of constraints to housing development in Ventura. So what are some of the potential solutions that we've heard from them? Inclusionary, definitely, we looked at your inclusionary and see if there is an opportunity to extend that to rental housing as well. We know that state law has changed recently to make it possible again to do inclusionary for rental housing. And we understand that the city is planning on updating its inclusionary ordinance. Is probably going to happen either concurrently with the housing element or shortly after the housing element. One of the other suggestions would be waiving and reducing and deferring fees for affordable housing. The other potential solution is an affordable housing overlay. That relates also again to the whole topic about site control, having to compete for sites with market developers. It's difficult. Having an affordable housing overlay and giving incentives for affordable housing would help that. There are also topics, discussions about motel conversion and adaptive reuse of existing buildings, such as the second floor office of in your commercial area. Maybe some of the second floor offices can be converted to housing. Motels, hotels that are not within the coastal zone, maybe there are opportunities to convert those to housing, because there are certainly vacancy issues and also conditions issues. Partnership with churches to provide housing on church properties. This is a very significant trend statewide, and certainly many mentions in Ventura County has been assisting a lot of nonprofits in Southern California to pursue that. We've seen a lot of increased interest in that. And last but not least, exploring means to generate affordable housing funds would be important. With that, I conclude my presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronica. That was a lot of information. You know, it was a lot to take in. There's certainly been some great conversation in the chat, going back and forth during Veronica's presentation. Some questions, some great ideas, and other conversation as well. But as Matt mentioned in the beginning, and then Lori as well, we're going to start with some questions and comments from the GPAC. We have some folks from the public also already lined up to ask some questions as well. But I want to start here asking the GPAC if you have some clarifying questions or comments or something that you'd like Veronica to respond to. Matt, should we keep the slides up, or should we go ahead and?
Let's take the slides down for now, and then I'd like to maybe invite Lori as the chair to just sort of frame this a little bit and kick it off with a question or two. As you're sort of preparing your thoughts, Lori, I just want to say this information is so complicated. There's so much detail. You know, apologies for essentially the drinking from a fire hose here. We know, you know, even when I've been doing this for years and it's still complicated for me. So if you're a little bit confused about some of this, that's okay. We're right there with you. But, you know, again, I just want to say I really love how this community uses the chat. You all are so respectful about sharing ideas and differences of opinion. And you brought up so many different things. So we're not gonna be able to answer every question right now that was in the chat. So what we're gonna do is, if you had a question that was in the chat and you wanna ask it, please do that. And please try and keep your questions really short and comments really short as well, because I think we're gonna have a lot of folks who wanna give comments. So Lori, I'm gonna, and then the way to, if you wanna, GPAC members, starting with you, if you wanna ask a question or give a comment, please use the raise hand feature in the participants so that we can see your hand raised.
And if you're having trouble with the raised hand function or you can't find it, feel free just to paste in the chat that you'd like to be called upon to.
And those who have, from the public who have sent Netta a message, I have a list here of who you are. Okay, Lori, go ahead. You get to go first.
Yeah, thank you for instructing how to raise a hand, because I was looking at that myself. I'm like, where is that hand? But so everyone asked a lot of really good questions. I was trying to survey, you know, the trends from the chat, and what I got from it was, you know, what about this housing element that's due in October based upon current standard versus what we're going to be submitting in February or next year, which would be the housing element 2.0. Is overpopulation really an issue for Ventura? I'm not sure if they have all the answers to every single question tonight. We're going to maybe choose, like, I'm going to choose like one or two, but what can we do for local control? Because that is important to us. But I heard Peter mention, or I read that we can highlight our form-based plans or our form-based plans and other opportunities that we have to build on that by adding in design standards and, you know, building that up, because that's the one thing that we do have control over. And if we clarify the design standards, that puts us in a better position and allows, when we do have affordable housing or moderate housing, for it to come in a way that is beneficial to the city. I heard questions about ADUs and improving the permitting process on ADUs, or how those qualify, or if those do qualify. I've heard about us, the city, leaning in on our nonprofits partners like the Housing Trust Fund, Cabrillo Economic Development Corporation, the Housing Authority. And the city is really doing a good job of that already, but what can we do more? And our strategy of infill development, and I believe I saw something about where are we looking at for housing? And the city's focus has always been strategic infill development, and that is locating and identifying vacancies, vacant buildings that can be transferred or rezoned or for residential. And then the last two things I thought was a really good question. Can affordable housing overlay opportunities be explained? What is affordable housing overlay? That's interesting. That's the first I've heard of that. And lastly, I just wanted to say that with inclusionary housing policy, currently it only applies to homes, not apartments. And so what that means is that we don't have currently any laws or ordinances that allow us to regulate or kind of create any policy to protect renters in apartments. And so that's the opportunity that we have as we move forward with the newer policy, inclusionary housing, to include apartments into that. And that's where the change is going to be. It's going to be up to you. There's a few other things to that, which is the 15% set aside that developers can come in with in lieu fees and say, hey, we want you to set aside 15% of your whole production just for affordable, very affordable. And or if you're going to do an in lieu fee, we and the city and everyone has to decide, is that in lieu fee going to cover the entire cost of a whole unit? Or is it just going to be a little bit of money they throw at the city that couldn't necessarily build an entire unit? But anyway, those are not questions. I just wanted to do a little bit of framing. Of all the things that I said, Matt or Veronica, was there any questions that you thought you were able to answer tonight from things that I mentioned?
Certainly, the affordable housing overlay, that's a concept that there are different ways to do it, and we've done it two ways before. One is that you provide significantly increased incentives for affordable housing. But in general, that may not be as needed anymore with the state density bonus that's very favorable. May not be needed anymore. But there may be other incentives that you can offer for affordable housing. But what is also very interesting about somehow other jurisdictions do with the affordable housing overlay is put it in places where market rate housing is not normally public. That you would not put it, you would not allow housing in those areas except if it's affordable. So that gives the nonprofit developers a leg up because they don't have to compete with market rate developers for the same pieces of properties. And so that's the most effective way of affordable housing overlay. But you do have to kind of look at where in your community would that be appropriate? We have seen jurisdictions put it in certain commercial areas that they would not allow market rate housing except for affordable housing. We've seen jurisdictions put it in light industrial areas and put artists live work there. And as affordable housing for artists, we've seen that before. We've also seen jurisdictions put affordable housing overlay on public and institutional uses. And that may actually dovetail really well with the church properties and public and, institutional uses. And there are some, we've seen that even some private schools that have extra properties, or public schools that they have surplus properties. We're beginning to see even schools want to put housing on their properties because they want to provide for their teachers. And so, yeah.
Well, I don't mean to interrupt you, but we can get more in detail. I just kind of wanted to, an idea, like a sneak peek into, because the next meeting.
Yeah, let's jump into some GPAC comments. We've got 8 or 9 folks that have their hands raised.
Well, no, before we did that, the 2 questions that I wanted answered, one by Peter and one by Matt, was the ADUs, and are those available to be counted as housing?
Yeah, I can actually quickly answer that, but do interrupt me, because I keep telling people, if you give me 5 minutes to talk about housing, I'll talk an hour. Sure. The ADUs, you do get to count that, but you do not get to count it based on capacity. So you cannot basically say that I have like 20,000 single family lots, therefore I can have at least 20,000, ADUs. You can only count it based on your historical trends of getting ADUs developed. Between 2018 and 2019, what's your annual average? You use that and project that into the future.
Okay, that's great, perfect. And then for Peter, do we have plans to improve our form-based controls and our design standards? Are we currently in the process of doing that?
Yeah, thank you, Lori. Let me also touch on the ADUs real quick, though, because I think one of the questions in the chat was about the cost.
Yeah, all my questions were from the chat. So all my questions are from you guys. So I'm not asking any of my own questions. Go ahead, Peter.
So the cost and process for an ADU is difficult. Know that that a developer of an apartment project has to deal with the same, actually more cost and more process. If you talk to affordable housing developers, the cost of providing each unit, I think averages out to, if the project is lucky, $300,000 to $500,000 per unit. So the cost of adding housing is a lot, and part of that is process, part of that is fees, and then as other people have commented, you have the land, you have labor, you have materials, and so on and so forth. So improving the process, being more efficient, making the rules make more sense, all of that's important and need to be looked at. Now, as it relates to the ability to get local control, there's, I think, a misconception that the state's law about objective design guidelines are for the residents. If you listen closely to what Veronica said, the objective design guidelines that the state wants cities to have are to give the developer certainty. They're not necessarily intended for what many of the chat comments intended. Now, we happen to have the closest thing we have to detailed objective standards on design are in our form-based codes, in our downtown specific plan, in our development codes, Midtown, and there's a handful of places. But if you're not in one of those, then all we do have are some more basic design guidelines, which are rather dated. They're still effective in being used in the process to get the project to be fairly well attractive, but we do need to find a way to either update our guidelines or use our form-based guidelines that we've already created and apply it to more of the city. That is on our list of things to do, and council has a number of goals that were set for this year. So it's not on the list for this fiscal year, but there is hope that in future years it will be able to be prioritized and worked on.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And last question for Matt or whoever decides to take it. Can someone just review, because it was a really big question in the beginning, why the housing element, or what is the difference between the housing element that we're going to be submitting in October and what's going to be then 2.0 revisited next year?
Let me answer that one really quickly. So just to reiterate what Veronica had said, we're doing a housing element now, which will be submitted to the state and adopted at the end of this year, the beginning of next year, which is going to be based on the existing general plan land use designations. It will also have all of the goals and policies and implementation actions in it. When the general plan has a new land use map, that housing element will be updated and then included as part of the new general plan, which will happen in 2022, 2023, late 2022 or early 2023.
And I think
it's just
part
going to
of
be an
that
update.
question, sorry, Matt, I think part of that question was just, they were concerned that we'd be stuck. Can you address that?
We get to, the policies are going to remain the policies, and we are just going to update the sites inventory based on the new land use map as needed. Okay.
Thank you, that's all.
Yeah. Okay, so I just want to, Susan, let's go to the questions. Maybe I'll have you call on folks. I'd like to remind everyone, including the people who are answering the questions, to be really brief. We have lots of hands up. This meeting goes for another hour and 5 minutes, so we do have some time to dive in to detail, but please be brief. Okay.
So let's start with Pete Freeman.
Guess I need to unmute, don't I?
Yes.
Veronica started with saying that, okay, the state says we're 3.5 million housing units are needed, and that the lack of supply is a big part of why the prices are what they are. And I was wondering if anybody's looked at or know, if we were to build all our RENA numbers and build out our 5,300 unit RENA numbers in the county, would that even have any effect on prices, and if so, how long would that take?
Great. Veronica, do you want to try to attack that one?
I don't think anybody would be able to answer that question. I'm not an economist, and certainly I wouldn't be able to kind of project what's the craziness of the housing market in California. Generally, my gut feeling is that even if we build that many units, you're not going to substantially change the price in Ventura County. That's the reason why inclusionary is important, because that guarantees the affordability. And
so thank you. Let's
and just really quickly, it's also the reason why it's not just Ventura who has to do this. It's why every city has to do this. And that's the important part of it.
Right, but if we did it in Ventura and other cities didn't meet their...
But everyone's going to meet their requirement, and we just have to know that that's going to happen.
So Erin, you're up.
Sprung that one on me. Veronica, I wanted to, can everybody hear me? Okay.
I hear you.
I was wondering if you could explain the whole motel conversion and what it means to be in the coastal zone. This is something I've been curious about, is it seems like we have a lot of motels and they're kind of run down, and many of them are in prime areas that we could put some housing, and maybe even some less prime areas that we could put some more affordable housing. But I don't know which of those would fall in that coastal zone.
Right. We certainly have to evaluate that, because the Coastal Commission has a policy that they don't like the loss of hotel motel rooms. And in fact, I think if you demolish one, you have to replenish it, because they want to keep like coastal being accessible to everybody. So so when we look at motel hotel conversions, we may have more opportunity to do that outside of the coastal area if there are such. But exactly your idea. A lot of them are run down, and they're perfect for conversion into housing. Port Hueneme has done it before and is proposing more. There are other jurisdictions that have done it, converting them into small apartments or merging rooms into units.
Thank you. So let's go Steph and then Stephanie. Steph Carbo.
Hey, Veronica, first I just want to say thank you. That was honestly truly the definition of drinking water out of a fire hose. I'm very overwhelmed. You're clearly an expert in this. This is fascinating. I feel like early on I heard you highlight that some of the best opportunities might be for affordable housing might come from city-owned properties, community land trusts. You highlighted a few others. And I saw in the slides that in June, like this month, there's supposed in the schedule, there's a sites inventory. Is the deliverable from that a map that everyone is going to be able to have as a resource to see where those would fit, or like where in the city, or what comes from that?
Yes, the deliverable as part of that will be a parcelized, parcel-specific database with maps that shows where we can consider that as vacant and underutilized. That's part of the housing element requirement. It will be very specific.
Stephanie.
Sorry, my internet is unstable, so I'm going to try and do this with my video off for a minute. So Veronica, again, thank you. That was a great presentation. You mentioned that 80% of the housing stock was over 40 years old in Ventura. How does that relate to communities that have more balanced housing options and availability? And is there a goal that a community should be striving for?
No, there's no specific standards. Ventura has a great kind of history, and you have a lot of historical resources and all of that. So there's no threshold as housing is too old, and if you're able to preserve the quality of it, you should. But I think, and in general, when you have an older housing stock, you not only do you have to pay attention to new production, you also have to pay attention to preservation.
Mm-hmm.
So Dana, then Kyler, and then Philip. So Dana.
Hi, yes, I agree. Thank you, Veronica. That was amazing. And I understood a significant percentage of what you said. And I'm grateful for the being on this learning curve. I asked at one point in there something about inclusionary housing, and somebody gamely tried to explain what that is. And I didn't understand that either. And that's not based on the person's explanation, it's my brain. And what I'm about to ask may be related to that, because I'm still learning here. I remember learning about a model years, sometime in the 90s, about, we're talking about low-income housing developments. And there's also a model that is where a certain percentage of any new development needs to be low income. And actually, I thought mistakenly that all developments that were coming into the city had to have some percentage of lower income, low, moderate, very low income housing. And I don't love the model about the low income housing developments. I know we need them, and there's an efficiency there. And there is the potential for a separation of people that concerns me. And so is it possible to require that developers make a certain amount of housing, a certain portion of their development be more affordable? And how does that all fit together? I'll stop my many.
Perfect. So Veronica, you want to?
Yeah. What you described is exactly inclusionary. So you understand it perfectly. But what has made inclusionary more feasible today than maybe 10 years ago is that state passed a new law that says if you adopt an inclusionary policy that requires no more than 15% of new development to be affordable, that would be considered as a legitimate local policy. That's discretionary decision. You don't have to explain it. This is just your discretionary policy authority to do so. And so that's the reason why we've seen a lot of communities now working on inclusionary, and the city of Ventura is planning on updating your policy.
Thank you. Kyler.
Great. Thank you so much, Veronica, for your presentation. At the very beginning, you had discussed some of the implications of the new legislation in the housing element. And I'm just wondering if you can provide an update for specifically on affirmatively furthering fair housing, AB 686, like when that required analysis, will it be done before the site inventory? And will that analysis be made available like separately, or?
We will try to do it concurrent with the housing element, but what we do have to do is actually, because we are not, at this time, housing element 1.0, we're not going to look at new sites that may be resulting for your general plan update. We are looking at sites that are currently available through your general plan. So what we are doing is once we have identified the sites, then we'll do the AFFH, affirmatively furthering fair housing analysis, and that component of it will be available for public review. But I can tell you that's a very extensive analysis. That's like about in itself is about 60 pages of maps and data and all that. So we have to do it once we have the sites inventory first.
Okay.
Philip.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna try and sneak 2 questions in here real quick. So we're talking about zoning and maybe perhaps changing some zoning from industrial commercial to more mixed use, I guess. But that got me thinking about SOAR, and I'm wondering if, push comes to shove and the plan we submit, not that it wouldn't get submitted on time, but doesn't get approved. Is there any ability of the state to force us to reconsider the SOAR initiative that we passed a couple times already, and how that process might work? And the second question is very general, is it sounded like we had about 5% of our housing stock was in manufactured or mobile home lots. And I'm wondering, because they're much more affordable, if that might be an option to consider in terms of expanding that housing stock, in terms of putting more affordable home in areas in the city. I know it's rent controlled and there's certain areas that have restrictions, but maybe some comments on that. Thanks.
I'm going to attempt to talk about SOARs, but I don't know enough to give you a definitive answer. But at this time, state law doesn't have the ability to mandate you not to implement SOAR. What the state does prohibit is, until 2025, is that you cannot have any growth control or growth management program that limits the number of housing units to be built in a community. So that would be illegal until up to 2025. But having a growth management policy like SOAR, I don't think that is that the state has the ability to prevent yet. Regarding the mobile homes, I do have to ask a question. Do you mean to create more mobile homes, or do you mean to put more housing in mobile homes?
No, in the area, so some new areas could be used as mobile or manufactured home lots, not converting existing homes, obviously, but vacant land or land that was industrial commercial, to use that space as mobile home parks.
I would say that that's, I haven't seen that being a strategy too much, just because think about mobile homes, they're actually at about usually about 8, at least 8, but usually about 12 to 15 units to the acre. So it used up quite a bit of land, and it may be a little bit inefficient when it comes to using land. And it's actually pretty difficult for financing for mobile home parks and people who do buy mobile homes and to like to go into that. And I think, you know, that the other thing I think would be something that you want to think about is you're missing the young families, you're missing the younger population. Is that the type of neighborhoods that would attract young population? I think that's probably something that is more important a question to answer.
Definitely some things to consider there. Looks like Steph, you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, you just mentioned, and I don't know, I didn't see it anywhere in the slides, but can you speak to Ventura and rent control? Is that something that we have locally? Could that be part of a housing plan? Where does rent control come into these conversations?
Okay, so I'm not going to talk about the COVID-related, eviction prevention and all that, but state of California right now actually does not have rent control. What we have is rent stabilization. The 1995 Multifamily Housing Act, also known as the Costa-Hawkins Act, kind of prevented rent control to actually happen. You can still adopt rent stabilization ordinance, but the rent stabilization ordinance would only cover multifamily housing stock that's built before 1995, or actually before 1995, before Costa-Hawkins. And it cannot cover single family, it cannot cover condominiums and condos that are used for rentals. So it would only be multifamily built doing that. So I guess there are some communities in the state that have gone ahead and adopt rent stabilization ordinance, subject to some of these very legal requirements. So the question again for the community is, how large is that rental housing stock in Ventura that's like multifamily apartments built prior to 1995 that would be cost efficient to do a program like that, because the staffing, administrative and legal kind of requirements for that can be quite expensive. So I haven't looked into that for Ventura, but that's some key considerations.
Definitely one of the tools that we can certainly explore a little bit more. I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
If I could just add on, we do have rent control for some of our mobile home parks.
Right. Yeah, you do have that. That is very useful, and definitely that's how it keeps the affordable rent, and that's a very important resource for some of your seniors in the community.
So I don't see any other GPAC hands right now. I take that back, Mr. Bill McReynolds.
Yeah, I had asked 2 questions in the chat. I just wanted to know, can we use the sphere of influence areas to meet some of the RHNA housing requirements?
Answer is simple, no. You could, if there is an annexation plan in place already and it can occur within 3 years. But you have to negotiate with the county to annex the arena associated with the land that you're annexing.
Okay, and then my second question was in regards to SB 330 and the design guidelines. Can you actually implement new design guidelines that would take effect before 2025 right now? Because everything locked, my understanding, is on January 1 of 2020.
I think you have to have objective design guidelines, but Matt, can you comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to have objective standards. Those are standards so that you can, and there's a difference here between standards and guidelines, right? So you need objective standards so that it provides certainty for developers and also certainty for the community to know what's going to happen. You can also have, I believe you can also have guidelines, but those guidelines cannot stop a project from going forward. They can guide what the community's vision is to help the development community design the projects in a way that meets the community's needs.
Yep. My question is specifically, can you implement new ones?
I believe you can, but I will need to go back and check that. Again, I think as long as it doesn't get in the way of the projects from being built and stop them from being built. But Bill, let me check on that and we can get back to you. We can get back to you at the next meeting.
Any other comments or questions from members of the GPAC? We have a number of community members that requested to make some comments earlier. And certainly members of the GPAC, if you have comments or questions as we're going into the community conversation, please feel free to still raise your hand. You can mix in there as well. So maybe I'll recognize Sonia Flores. I've requested in the chat to speak.
Thank you. My name is Sonia Flores, and I'm a resident of the city of Ventura. I'm also a member of Homes for All. And I'm here just to speak up to you about the housing element and our different recommendations that we sent to the city of Ventura and to the city council last week. I wanted to also talk from the perspective as being a renter. I'm a renter here in the city. And as you can see from the data that was given by Veronica, a 1-bedroom in the city of Ventura is $2,010 right now. And that's a 34% increase from 2016. That's a huge increase in that time frame. And what we need to keep in mind is even though a 1-bedroom might be $2,010, the landlord who is taking applications is asking for 3 times that amount that a person make in order to qualify for that unit. So that would be, a person would need to make $6,300 per month in order to qualify for that 1-bedroom. And I'm encountering that right now, as I look for different rentals. And another thing that impacted the rental market was that when COVID hit, at about the 2 or 3 month mark, what we saw is that a lot of the companies that were employing people all over California, they were allowing their employees to stay home, and they were allowing them to work from home. Well, a lot of people decided that they wanted to make their home elsewhere because they were no longer tethered to their home base. So then we had this influx of people from Los Angeles, from the other surrounding areas. And within literally that 2 to 3 month time frame right after the lockdown, rents went up by $300 or $400 per unit. And I had been following it because I'm always looking for different rentals just in case I want to move. And it was a huge jump. And that cost for those rentals has not gone down. So we're still being impacted by that. And so I wanted to just stress that first. And then the second thing is I wanted to talk about one of the recommendations that we made on our Homes for All and VSSTF letter that we submitted to the city of Ventura and the city council. As was mentioned before, a really great tool in order to produce more affordable housing is the use of an affordable housing zoning overlay. And this is not a new concept. This has been done in several other cities in California. There's been done in the city of Oxnard. It's been done in the city of Santa Paula. So it's actually a tool, and I think the city of Oxnard, had it in their last 2 housing element planning periods. So this tool has been effective in producing affordable housing or allowing developers to more easily produce affordable housing. And a couple of the other components of an affordable housing overlay is that well, one of the things we're asking for actually is that basically that pieces of land that are 2 acres in size or over and that are a density at 30 dwelling units per acre or over are included in the affordable housing overlay. And we actually provided a whole list of several parcels in the city that are vacant, that are 2 acres in size or over, and that are that we would like to be at a density of 30 dwelling units per acre or over. And how we came to this is that we have several different developers, affordable housing developers, that are part of Homes for All. There's many mansions, CEDC, People Self-Help, the Housing Authority, and they all came to a consensus that basically this is what is needed to actually make a project pencil out. And the problem is that in the last housing element planning period, in the last housing element document, there was only 6 pieces of land that were 2 acres or over in size and that were at densities of 30 dwelling units per acre or over. That's not enough land.
So thank you, Sonia. And let me ask Peter and Netta, is that letter something that can be shared with the GPAC as well? Just sounds like Sonia has a lot of information to share.
Sure, we can post it as public comment at the next GPAC packet.
Perfect, thanks. Clyde Reynolds. I can find Clyde.
Yes, I'm Clyde Reynolds. I'm also a resident of Ventura, and I represent another group called Vulnerable Populations Housing Advocacy Network. but I've also been a participant in the letter that's been put together by Homes for All and Ventura Social Service Task Force. And given the fact that 45% of Ventura households are very low income and low income households, and that 80% of extremely low income, 86% of very low income, and 65% of low income renters are rent burdened, and the fact that Ventura only produced 25% of their very low income and 90% of their low income housing units, and are going to be expected to have an increase of 35% in the area of very low income housing units and a 46% increase in those units that are low income. Another one of the proposals we have is for a zoning code amendment to adopt a housing by right housing ordinance. This by right housing ordinance will permit multifamily affordable residences uses by right in zones that currently permit large multifamily housing, an example being commercial zones. That would apply to specifically very low and low income housing developments by using a ministerial review process to provide additional incentives for low income housing developers. So in addition to the overlay, this actually applies to specific zones.
Thank you, Mr.
So the
Reynolds.
question is the city willing to also look at this kind of a proposal as well?
So Veronica, do you have any thoughts on the by right?
There is already some provisions under state law that would require by right already. AB 1397 says that sites that we are reusing from the fifth cycle housing element and sites that will be rezoning after the statutory deadline, those sites will be subject to by right approval with if the project comes in with 20% affordable to lower income.
Great. And so that's definitely something to we'll keep exploring as well, along with some of these other tools for sure.
Susan, could I recommend that we're going to have a public comment period at the end, and that if we can kind of use this time, right now for really more question and answer, to get a sort of more common understanding of some of the housing issues and challenges, that would be really helpful. And then if any of the speakers who said they want to speak actually in public comment, maybe we can wait for that at the end and just continue with the Q&A.
Sure. So as I'm calling out your name, if you feel like you have more of a comment you'd like to make at the end, you can. If you just want to say I'll hold my comment till the end, that's great. If you have a specific question for Veronica or the team here, that would be great. So Samuel Coates was the next name I saw.
Yeah, I think what I got to say would fit a little more into the comment category, but thank you.
Perfect. So I'll wait till the end for you. Maria Navarro.
Same here.
Okay. I know we had Judy Alexander who had to ask to speak before 7 if possible, and I don't know if she's still on the call. Not likely. Carl Morehouse.
I'll wait to the end as well.
Perfect. And then Don Dyer, I know you had a comment during when we were talking about rent control or question there. I saw you had your hand up for a moment. If you'd like to.
That's okay. I think my question was answered in the comment. I just wanted to make the point that, or just wanted to ask about AB 1482, which really does allow rent control now in California. That just went into effect in 2020 and is in effect until 2030. So I guess would like a little clarification for the group about rent control. I know you did mention that it still has to be in keeping with the Costa-Hawkins Act, but wouldn't that still provide what most people would consider rent control and in the broadest sense of the word, and particularly in a town like Ventura, where so much of our housing stock is older than 15 years. Is it correct that the Costa-Hawkins only protects or keeps properties out of rent control for 15 years? I guess that's my question.
The technical details of it, I have to really review it myself. I think AB 1482 is rent control in a sense that it's controlling the rent increases. is not controlling rent itself. So I think that's the difference. So
we'll dig into that a little bit more and maybe be able to have some more information.
Okay,
Trevor.
I would appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes, we'll definitely come back to that, Dawn. Trevor Gottsman. I think you're still muted, Trevor.
Thanks, guys. Good evening, everybody. Thank you. My comment is regarding, firstly, a community service. I live in a home here that I bought specifically for my family. My family is all of you guys. My kids are spread out wherever they are. I have spare rooms. I have people asking me, can I park in your driveway? I've got hoses out there for them to stay there and what have you. I would love to be able to set up or have our community see who would be interested, especially us, the older community. It's wonderful to have the vitality of younger people around and people, and especially when you've got something that you can offer. And so, we've all got these spare rooms and bits and pieces, and shooing the unwanted creatures away from them takes a lot of unnecessary effort, and it keeps things in, keeping things in check and keeping things in balance. I think if we allow a community sort of like do a census of a poll of who's willing to open up a spare room without any a spiritual religious affiliation. It is a spiritual, it's a universal kind of affiliation we all have, that we connect and we're a community. So this builds community. I see it. Just asking your next door neighbor, you've got a friend or daughter, my daughter needs a room. Do you know anybody's got a room? And that kind of a thing. But people who can somewhat commit, that can be, as I say, our community builders, or people who you can depend on and trust, and we can build the trust and develop that. That's what I'm so, and using the existing housing stock and saying, look, these are single family residences. The city right now, there's nothing I can do except have visitors come over. And I've done that for many years. And but to have this on a sustainable way, especially for the aging community and the aging households and the aging homes, it's a way to keep things healthy and keep things fresh. So
thank you.
I would suggest
thank you.
Thank you.
It's a great idea. Thank you, Trevor. Karen Clark. Is Karen still with us?
Yes, mine's a comment.
Do you want to wait till the end, or would you like?
Sure, I'm happy to speak now. So on behalf of the Ventura Farm Worker Housing Committee, I just wanted to make the comment that it's particularly important to address farm housing. Agriculture is a really important part of our economy, and farm workers are particularly low income and in need of decent housing if we're going to continue to maintain that part of our economy. And just a couple of other comments. I mean, I know it's pretty radical, but I think we should look at eliminating single family zoning as a way to address fair housing issues. And funding, it's been mentioned, but we need more funding for affordable housing, and the Housing Trust Fund is a particularly good way to address that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dana, you had your hand up a moment ago. I saw you put it down. Did you have a comment or question?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. Any other?
Susan, Nick Deitch had also in the chat said he had a question.
Perfect. Go ahead, Nick.
Thanks. I don't know how to do a hand raise other than just wave my hand. Maybe I'm missing a tool.
That works.
Okay. First of all, this is just really excellent material you guys are sharing, and the chats and the comments are really wonderfully diverse. I think these meetings are extraordinary, and I hope that we can, out of all of this, we can really manifest some significant change and retooling of the city's plans. I do believe that there is a substantial amount of land within our existing boundaries, along our corridors, and in some of our aged commercial areas that represents tremendous capacity, not just to build housing, but to build community and to retool our community. And I'm wondering if you could just elaborate a little bit on how you see all of this information that you're gathering and that we're sharing, how that will be translated into an intelligent, thoughtful, strategic plan for growing the city. There's a whole lot of questions here and a lot of people who are not involved on a daily basis in this process. Could you just give us a little bit of overview of what we'll do with this information? It's not just about numbers and housing units, it's about building community. That's my question. How do we get there? That's a big question, I know that.
Oh, yeah, that's certainly a very big question, but I think this is like an initial step. Definitely, when we formulate the housing plan, we definitely want to work with staff and that's and also some of the stakeholders to incorporate some of the comments that we have heard about. It's not going to, the housing element is not going to be detailed enough to have an exact roadmap in the next 5 years how you're going to get there, but these are the things that we want to pursue. Is the city willing to pursue a community land trust? Is the city willing to pursue rent control? So those are the things that would kind of like it sets a time frame in terms of what are the things that the city will be pursuing in the next few years, not the next 8 years, because you want to be able to start implementing some of these. So what can the city do realistically with the capacity that you have? What are the priorities? And that's certainly something that we need to set, we need to establish with the GPAC, with the community. What are the, not everything under the sun. There's no way that you can pursue everything, but out of the capacity and the priorities, what would be the 10 things that you want to do, in the next few years? I think, I can't really say which are the ones that we're going to include, because it's not for me to decide. I can make some recommendation, but it's the community that's going to help me in.
I would just add too, Nicholas, that the general plan itself, the entire document, is really intended to do what you're saying as well. So it's not just the housing element that will be there to build those communities. It's all those other elements, all the other policies in that document that will contribute to the larger kind of vision that you're going for. So those are really important components.
And actually, can I just jump in? Lori in the chat brought something up, which was how do we essentially deal with balance the sort of the housing strain and social service issues while preserving the character of the community. And the response was, that's the $64,000 question. That was from Kathy. And, I think that's right. And a lot of the comments that are in here are less about the technical part of the housing element and how do you actually build the community, continue for the community to evolve, to provide for the needs of those who are living here now, those who grew up here who may want to come back. I know that was part of the discussion, who this is for, but also do that while keeping the character of the community and keeping the community's affordability. And that's what the general plan is. And it is no easy task at this time. But, with all of you, we've got great partners in the process. And the ideas and the thoughts that are in here at this meeting and at other meetings really help us a lot, which is why I said at the beginning, keep the thoughts and comments coming.
Dawn, do you have your hand up?
Thank you, Susan. And to Matt's point, and kind of back to Nick's as well, this is sort of a technical question, so I'll try to keep it in a simplified form. The new housing element laws, as I understand, in order to include the types of sites that Nick was talking about, obsolete commercial or even obsolete industrial sites that otherwise would be good housing sites, in our housing element, I understand, and please correct me if this isn't true, that they either have to be currently zoned for housing, or if they're not currently zoned for housing, the site has to be vacant of improvements. How does the city, how can we navigate that process? Is there any flexibility so that we can move forward with a vision where we can look at our infill, because Ventura is such an old city. We have many buildings that truly are obsolete. They just need to be torn down and rebuilt with something new and re-envisioned and recreated. How do we navigate that? What is the plan with the housing element? I understand we're doing an interim one, for lack of a better word, to meet the schedule that's required by HCD, and it will be updated once we complete the general plan. Can you speak to that a little bit about
Veronica,
how?
do you want me to handle this one?
Sure.
So, Donna, I think you actually answered the question pretty well, and sort of building off of what Nick had said, which is that, we are right now doing our best to use the existing zoning in order to meet the RENA requirements. That process that we are doing is not visioning the city. It's not creating the vision and creating the community. Mm-hmm. That creating the vision in the community is part of the larger general plan process of creating a vision statement, guiding principles, identifying areas that you want to see change in, identifying what change and what the vision for those areas is, and then moving that through into the full general plan itself with the land use designations. So that process is happening. It's happening. As I had sort of mentioned previously, it would have happened in parallel with the general plan update, but because of COVID and a late start on things, we had to move the housing element ahead forward. But the housing element, and that's why we're sort of doing it twice. We're doing the redo of the housing element for that site's inventory in order to make sure that it meets the vision. But it really is the visioning in the general plan that's the most important part for what you and many other people are talking about tonight.
So, and Matt, will there be flexibility under the new laws to do what we're talking about, reuse these sites, even if they're not in the housing?
Yeah, that's again, a really good point. So the city can create a vision for an area and can rezone and create new land use designations for any area that it wants. And so you can take commercial corridors if you want that are just allow commercial and allow housing in some of those areas. You can do that at any time, and that has nothing to do with the housing element at all. The housing element only comes in when you then take those areas and identify sites for the site selection. So the city can take any area that it wants and create any vision that it wants, so long as it's meeting the housing element, and we know that's going to happen.
So some of the suggestions might be to just simply include housing as an overlay in many areas to allow more flexibility might be a good way to accomplish that.
Yep, and that has to be balanced. And again, I want to point out there was a comment that was made about right now the city has a pretty good balance of jobs and housing. So how if you redesignate the entire city as housing with no jobs, well, you lose the jobs and you lose the economic base. And if you take all of the areas that are currently for hotels and motels and visitors, well, then you lose the transient occupancy tax and you lose the ability of people to come to the city. So we have to look at this as a big picture and balance the housing needs and growth in housing with also economic development, which is what we talked about last time, to make sure the city still has the money coming in from visitors and from the jobs to support the services that the residents want.
So we have about 5 more
absolutely.
minutes.
Thank you.
About 5 more minutes till we go to public comment. Steph, I saw you had your hand up a moment ago. If you still have a question.
Yeah, I was just going to quickly ask Veronica if there's are there cities or neighborhoods in, either California or more generally United States of America that you see that you're like, oh, sigh, they're doing it right. What are those cities and then do they have a certain policy that the community should be advocating for to city council? I don't know, who's doing it?
Well, it's difficult to say that, to identify a city because every city is unique and the challenges and approaches are unique. But I've worked with some communities that I just love the whole attitude, like West Hollywood, and how they think about housing. And Long Beach, they are confronting the whole segregation and issue very positively and very directly. and even some communities, I didn't think that would be very progressive, and until I go into there, and then they have some really interesting policy. You look at Ojai, they have a policy to make sure that they conserve their capacity and not have developers wasted the land and say, well, you're not building at what we planned for, at the density that we planned for, you're going to pay us an in lieu fee. And that was pretty progressive concept, to pay an in lieu fee to build lower density. And that's like, I think each community has this unique response. Not some of them, I would say not each, but there are, many jurisdictions have very unique responses, and it would be very difficult to identify one that would be just done it right, and that everything they do would be something that would be appropriate for you. I think that would be typical, and that would be wrong to do it. Yeah.
And just Steph, to jump in on this. So, the question that I would have is, do it right for who? Because as you saw in the chat, there's lots of different ideas about what that means. And what we need to do in the process is to identify what the vision is and what you all want. And then let us come to you with how we think we can achieve that. And we can give you examples of what other communities have done to achieve that. And so, I think it starts, and I think a lot of people will say, Ventura's done it right. Like, you all have done so many things right here, which is why it's so popular and why people want to be there.
Right.
Right. So, like, yes, you have some challenges with housing, but so does everybody else right now. So I would just say, let's figure out what the community's vision is, what you want to achieve, and then we'll figure out how to get there.
We have time, I think, for one more question for Veronica, while we have her brain power here this evening. It's not the last time you'll see her, but any additional questions?
I want to say there were a lot of questions that were asked in the chat. We're going to do our best to respond to a lot of those in the interim between now and the next meeting. But there were a lot of questions. So please excuse us if we kind of group questions together and then answer some at the next meeting, which we're having on the 29th. But if there are no more questions, Susan, let's move to the official public comment, or to the comment period. And we'll ask folks, to try and keep your comments to about a minute or a minute and a half. And we'll just keep rough track of that. But we know that we have a number of folks who want to speak tonight.
So I have Samuel Coates, Maria Navarro, and Carl Morehouse. And if any other folks would like to speak, please go ahead and raise your hand as well. So we'll start with Samuel.
Thank you, Susan. So my name's Sam. I'm 20 years old. I've lived in Ventura for my whole life, and I want to speak from that kind of perspective as like a young person who's also like a long-time resident of the town. And I'm worried. I'm worried that I'm not going to be able to afford to live here once I'm out of my parents' house. Most of my friends are worried about that situation too. And I think that what we're all kind of agreeing on is that the most important thing we can do to fix it is get supply up. And we're very lucky that we have a lot of different tools in our toolbox here, but it feels like the big kahuna is this R1 zoning. And we can talk about like modifying commercial properties, we can talk about overlays and other stuff, but the fact is that the majority of land, the big majority of land in the city is set aside for these single unit homes. And if we're not willing to touch that, we're not really addressing what's constricting supply in the vast majority of the city. And it's totally cool, totally understandable that some people are worried about traffic. Some people are worried about like neighborhood character. And there are a lot of parts of town where there's a mix of single homes and duplexes and triplexes. And in my opinion, it looks pretty fine. There's no like congestion. The neighborhood looks nice yards. Everyone's happy. And I guess my case is if you're not willing to change things up for a bunch of transplants that you haven't met, do it for your kids, do it for your friends' kids, your neighbors' kids, because we need it. And if we're not willing to use all the tools we got in our toolbox, then people like me and my friends are going to have to find somewhere else to live. And I really think that'd be a shame. So I hope the plan makes some serious changes to R1, and I really hope you guys can make that happen.
Thank you, Samuel. Maria Navarro.
Yeah, so much like Samuel, I'm a 26-year-old who's lived here as well for quite a bit of time. And, like what he said the other day, it's just so heartbreaking. I had a conversation with one of my close friends who was actually considering downsizing her wedding and not having a honeymoon, just so she can have and save up for a down payment for a house. So I think this housing crisis that we're living in right now just disproportionately impacts all of us who are here, who are young, and who, we're professionals, but we just can't afford anything around here anymore. And so, having said that, yes, we need more housing, we need more supply, we need hopefully to get rid of R1 and include more mixed zoning, right, everywhere. And so, but I do want to highlight that we have to protect low-income housing in our low-income communities, because if it isn't for the efforts that we've made and we consciously make to have inclusionary ordinances, to have affordable housing overlays, to have a housing trust fund so that affordable housing organizations can make affordable housing for low-income folks, we wouldn't even be meeting those 25%, right? So we need to strengthen and continue those policies. And I want to talk about something that we don't really talk about, which is tenants' rights here. And we have seen, that the vacancy rate in Ventura has been really, really hit lately just because of the fires, the pandemic, and it's really brought rental rates really up. And it has also made it hard for low-income families and for young people to stay here. I know I have a friend who, his rent increased $90, which is completely legal under AB 1482, and he had to move to Santa Paula. He can't live here anymore. And so we need, what I would propose and what we have proposed with Homes for All, the letter that what we're willing to send or we have sent, is that the housing element includes a goal that promotes the preservation and maintenance of affordable rental properties and affordable housing, and programs that can do this would be a rent stabilization, a local rent stabilization ordinance, or a just cause eviction protection. And we just really want the city to study whether these programs could be made and whether they would have a positive impact in Ventura.
Great. Thank you so much, Maria. Carl Morehouse.
Thank
and
you.
I see Max as well.
I'll be quick. I know at last meeting I invited a number of you. You don't all have the luxury that I do to sit through 3 hours of SCAG USC demographics workshop stuff today like I did or last Tuesday, but there's some important takeaways. Today was called post-pandemic. These are some of what things the data are showing, that as a result of the pandemic, there will continue to be more people working at home. That has, I think, as Sonia indicated earlier, causing people to move. What we're finding now is there was predictions that the millennials were going to stay downtown and they were going to live this single lifestyle. Well, now they're falling into the pattern of wanting single family homes. Problem is us baby boomers are occupying a lot of that housing and not moving, partly because of Prop 13 and a number of other reasons. The millennial shift, though, is driving it out into the suburbs. And so we're going back to this suburban drive again. The interesting thing is you're planning for the future. Gen X is going to be the smallest population cohort in quite a while. There are fewer of them. So that by the time they get there, it's not going to be quite the jam up that there is between the boomers and the millennials. The other thing I want to point out, two other things is as we go into the coastal zone, Santa Barbara recently lost to the Coastal Commission. Remember, then the Coastal Act, the most important thing is visitor serving. Therefore, when there was efforts to buy up houses for Airbnbs and Santa Barbara tried to stop it, the city lost to the Coastal Commission. My final question is, what is a healthy vacancy rate for a market? I know that for apartments, it should be about 5% or so. The fire, if Thomas Fire didn't teach us anything with losing 500 homes, we have no capacity to absorb. Everybody ran and grabbed everything that was rental. And those who couldn't get there are now living in Thousand Oaks, Oxnard, Camarillo, wherever else, because they couldn't get here. What's a healthy market to be in for housing? Because the big one is going to come. I've been through enough stuff with Lucy Jones. When the big earthquake hits, we're going to have a lot more housing problems, and somebody's got to move somewhere. If you want to stay in Ventura, What's the absorption rate?
Thank you, Carl. Max Guinness, that's that right?
Yeah, yes. Thank you, Susan. Thanks, GPAC members. So my name's Max. I actually live in Oxnard, but I'm a member of Ventura County YIMBY. So I come to Ventura frequently, and you know, your housing shortage affects us too. When Ventura requires single-family zoning, that requires more people to spend more on housing because they have to buy a whole piece of land, and that makes the whole area less affordable. It also puts more vehicles on the road. Obviously, parking requirements put more vehicles on the road. I don't feel safe biking around here. I bike into Ventura sometimes. I do it, it doesn't feel great. And that's partially because the planning processes have made it unsafe by really bringing a lot of vehicle-centric planning. So I think there's a real good opportunity to improve affordability of Ventura, improve sustainability, and make it more inclusive, because I'm not quite as young as a couple of the earlier speakers, but I grew up in California, and a lot of my friends I grew up with moved out of state because it was just way too expensive. So this is a crisis that's going to continue to displace people. And it's not in conflict with, I've seen a couple concerns about property values. I think a lot of people have enjoyed a lot more revenue as a side income from having ADUs. And so that state legislation that's made ADUs possible, ending R1 zoning would have the same effect. A lot of homeowners would newly be able to have a duplex, maybe live in one unit, rent out the other. This would be a really great way to actually raise property values. So I think all these things kind of move in tandem and move toward a positive direction if we allow for more liberal zoning. So thanks.
Thank you, Max. I don't see any other hands unless, Netta, you saw somebody in the chat ask to speak that I didn't see.
I have not.
Okay. So I'm not seeing any other speakers. Matt, I'll turn it back over to you to walk us through those final slides. And Veronica, if you want to put up the slides again.
Oh.
Sorry, I should have warned you, Veronica.
Okay, yeah, I closed the PowerPoint already.
That's all right. I'll just start. So we have our next meeting on the 29th, on June 29th. That is going to be a GPAC meeting that's going to follow more of the traditional GPAC format. So with public comment at the end for the public, although we encourage all of the public to attend. We're going to be doing a review of some of the sites inventory that Veronica has come up with. Can you make that full screen, Veronica? Thanks. So we're going to do a review of the sites inventory, and then we are going to talk about some of the policies that could be included in the housing element, and we're going to respond to some of the questions that came up this evening. So we really encourage all of you to come to that meeting. From there, the housing element, we're going to have a draft housing element. It's going to go to the Planning Commission for review, as well as the public overall for review. As with many of the documents, the GPAC, it doesn't review and approve the documents. We seek your input as we are developing the documents, and that's what the next meeting is for. In mid-July, the GPAC meeting is going to be July 20th, is going to be on vision and guiding principles. So we're going to shift gears a little from the detail of the housing and then go big picture to the direction. And again, a lot of the comments that have come out this evening really help us with the vision and the guiding principles. We also have other activities that are going on. We're planning a health equity and environmental justice educational forum for later in July. And then we're doing reaching out to community groups and the community councils to do meetings with those groups to dive in deeper, either into specific topics or issues, or geographically, as is the case with the community councils. We have the meeting on the 29th. You'll please go and sign up for those. We will provide summary notes from this meeting. Please check the website at planventura.com, I believe it's .com. And we have lots of information and notes from all of the past meetings up there, as well as background information as well. With that, Lori and Doug, actually Doug, maybe I'll turn it to you if you have any final closing comments.
Great. Thank you, man. Appreciate it. First, I just want to say is that, man, I got to tell you, one of the best things that's come out of this pandemic and with all the Zoom meetings is the chat. I absolutely love the chat. So thank you so much for all these good comments and all the questions and all the information. I had a hard time first listening to all the speakers and then watching all the chat, but it's very informative, very thought-provoking. But I wanted to also kind of summarize a few thoughts that I have is that, as a leader, we always have to watch when we pass policies or set policies, set processes, we have to watch what we're encouraging and discouraging from happening. A lot of the problems that we're talking about today absolutely did not happen yesterday. They happened years and years and years ago. And now we're left with the mess that's been created. Now, I believe that we live in the most fortunate state this world has ever seen in every way, shape, and form, except for one thing. We couldn't control our growth. We couldn't figure out how to maintain what we love about our communities and still grow and allow for the next, for more people or the next generation to stay put and continue spreading their roots. Ventura is really fortunate because we have managed to save a lot of what we love about our community. And through many of our outreach over the last 30 years that I've seen, we're all in pretty much agreement what we love about our community and the uniqueness that we have. And I hope to, on the city council, be able to promote our history and our art and our creativity and the uniqueness of who we are and how down to earth this community is. And it's the best of old California. But what I see that's wrong is sometimes we've got to watch what we wish for, because I believe in watching the last 30 years, or at least 20 years, that exactly what we didn't want to happen is happening. And it's happening because we said, we don't want one more car, not one more house. Enough's enough. I have my house, and that's all that matters. A lot of those same people that I know that said that 20 years ago are now driving to Arizona, Nevada, and Texas to see their grandkids. And I don't believe that's really a sustainable or a healthy form of existence of life. I think the next generation not only has a right, but a responsibility to help spread the roots in the community that raised them and be part of that community. And that's what I love about building community. I wanted to mention that some of the things that I mentioned that started years and years ago is that we started building the same home over and over and over again for good reasons, to make it more affordable. Okay, but we started doing that all across our state, all across the country. And we started homogenizing beautiful valleys, beautiful orchards, hillsides, in ocean fronts to look and feel exactly the same. Now, a lot of those neighborhoods are clean and safe and predictable. We knew who our neighbors were probably going to be. We knew about raising our kids and what was going to happen and what type of risks may transpire in that neighborhood. With all that said, we ignored the natural bell curve of housing that is, I believe, a sustainable bell curve, such as what we see in downtown and midtown Ventura, where you naturally see inclusionary housing. You see houses of various shapes and sizes from 600 square feet to 6,000 square feet. And they're right next to each other. And that enriches our communities to see that. That hasn't been built like that for many decades. Along with that, I want to mention that in the past, and I've watched it in my lifetime, where we've not only discouraged people from turning their garages into ADUs, and yet people did it anyways and got fined terribly when cities found out they did that. But now we want everybody to have an ADU. But worse than that, we wouldn't even let people have a second sink and a separate entrance into a bedroom, because God forbid they rented that out, or maybe that crazy uncle might want to stay there. Okay, now we're paying the price with homelessness. We're paying the price with the lack of affordability. And I look at our codes. When you have to look at what's the true cost of housing. Unfortunately, people seem to think it's just the developer wants a lot of profit. The reality is our processes are so convoluted, so not unpredictable, so risky, and so costly that I believe 30% of the cost of every new home is our process. That's what I believe. So if we really want to lower the cost of housing, we will fix our processes. Secondly, and this hasn't come up because it's kind of not politically correct, but I will, because I believe in saying the truth, is our codes change constantly. Okay, we went from living in teepees to living in homes that instead of 30 yards of concrete for a foundation, we now have 300 yards of concrete for a foundation. Okay, all because, not because we want to protect the home, but because we want to protect the people that might be inside the home, which is great. Every life we save is very important. I believe everybody offers value to our community. But the reality is, if you can't afford to live in that home, because it now costs 2 and 3 times the cost, because the state keeps raising its standards and its codes, that's a real problem. I'm being in the trades, I see it. I know exactly why these new homes are costing $1.2 million to rebuild what cost $20,000 to build 50 years ago. And it's not just because of inflation, it's because of the codes. And finally, I will say that the lack of transportation. It's unconscionable to me as somebody that is a native Californian and somebody who loves the state and would do anything to help make sure ensure we have the best future for us. It's unconscionable that we do not have an effective mass transit system all the way across this beautiful state. The biggest degradation of our cost of our standard of living is the cost of living here and spending 20 to 30% of your life sitting in traffic. Thank God we could at least talk on our phones or listen to music, right? But also, and finally, is that Prop 13 gave us a surety that we'd be able to afford to stay in our homes because it was getting outrageous back in the late 70s and 80s. How values were going up, taxes were going up, and people were having to lose their homes because they couldn't afford the tax. The problem is, what did we incentivize? We incentivized people to stay put in that home forever. Instead of the empty nesters, the older baby boomers moving out of their home and freeing it up for the next generation, as Carl was just saying, they're staying there because guess what? They're paying $1,000 a year in property taxes for the same home that the neighbor's paying $15,000 a year in property taxes. Okay, so we incentivize them to not give up that home to the next generation. We are so fortunate in Ventura because we have the opportunity with our corridors, with growing from west to east, to really add the housing that we need in a way that complements and enhances what we love about our community. I have absolutely no doubt that we can make what we love about Ventura even better. But we have to look at transportation. We have to look at our corridors, our walkability, our urban forest, and locating jobs closer to where we live. And I'll close with this. I would love to know, since we're a job-rich city, how many of those jobs in Ventura are being filled by Venturans? Because as a 36-year resident now of the city, I will say that I believe that if you live and work in Ventura, you probably, most of us, are either work for government or self-employed. So I believe there's a lot of influx of people taking our jobs, and a lot of Venturans are commuting outside of Ventura for work. And as an employer, I cannot find anybody that can work in the trades in Ventura. It's extremely difficult to hire. If I could find 20 or 30 more people tomorrow, I would hire them. So I just want to close on that positive note, I guess, because there's so much opportunity. And I know together we're going to make the best future and we're going to start doing things differently, because the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expect different results. So I love everything I'm seeing. I can't thank everybody for participating. And thank you for letting me ramble on at the end of the night.
All right, Doug, thank you. Thank you to you and to Lori for the framing, the bookending of the meeting. We really appreciate it. You got lots of thank yous and congrats in the chat if you weren't looking when you were speaking, Doug. So with that, we are a couple minutes over. Thank you all again for participating. Thank you all for the great comments and the thoughts. And we will see hopefully all of you and more of you on the 29th. Until then, have a good night, everybody.